Welcome to the first video in the DSLR basics section. In this particular video we're going to talk about the first point of our triangle, which is framing, and that includes composition and perspective and where you put your subjects in the photographs. Once you've decided what you're going to take, what your subject is, you've picked your subject, and then the next real big choice is which lens you're going to use, because you could either have a wide lens if you need to take a really wide view, if it's like a scenery photograph or like interior shots for kind of like architecture or interiors of houses. You want to have quite a wide view to be able to take in the whole room. Or you may need to have a longer lens or a telephoto where you can actually magnify and you're zooming in. You're actually magnifying something so in those cases where you can't get close to your subject and you want to bring your subject closer. So the first thing I should probably mention is talk a little bit about focal length, because that can be a little confusing for people. Focal length is in millimeters, and what it is the smaller the number, the wider the view. So 16 millimeters is quite wide, especially on a full frame sensor. I should probably just show you on the whiteboard exactly what I'm talking about. So this is our lens, and the focal length is really related to how close the actual sensor is from your focusing elements. So if it's closer, then you have a wider view, and if your lens elements are further away from your sensor, then the view's narrower. And so the focal length, wide angle lenses, which are smaller distances in the lens elements, so a focal length is smaller, will have a wider field of view. And that can get extreme. You can get to the point where you have a fisheye lens which can cover like 180 degrees. Now, you can also get zoom lenses, and zoom lenses, what they do is they actually modify the lens elements so that you have a wider view and you can range from a wider to a narrow view, so you change your magnification. So a narrow view will basically make the object bigger on your final frame, so it's effectively magnifying. Now you can get prime lenses which have a single focal length. Here I have a 50 millimeter. So that has a fixed view, a fixed angle of view. So if you want to change how much is in the picture, you really have to get closer or further away. And that's one of the advantages of zoom lenses, is it gives you that flexibility where you can change how much your field of view, how much you include in your framing by changing the zoom setting. And finally here I have a longer zoom. So you can see that larger focal length lenses, because of that distance in the lens elements, as you get a longer focal length lens, higher magnification, the actual physical size of the lens gets bigger. So now here, this is actually a zoom too. So here we're looking at a 70 to 200. So it ranges from just beyond a 50 millimeter lens. 50 millimeter lens is usually called a standard lens, because when you have it set at 50 on a full frame sensor, this is a Canon 5D, so it has a full frame sensor. It has the same magnification as your eye. So 50 millimeter, when you look through the viewfinder and then you take away and look with the eye, it has roughly the same view magnification as the human eye. And then beyond 50 millimeters is considered telephoto. And then less is called wide angle. The reason why the focal length choice is important too when you're framing your objects is to do with not just how big you want the object in your photograph, it's to do with the perspective. Because wide angle lenses, when you have a wider view, you have much more exaggerated perspective. So that's like if you're really close to an object and you have a wide view, the object will be really big and then things will get small really quick, so it exaggerates that perspective. So like for instance, if you're taking photographs of your dog, and you want them to look like Snoopy with a huge nose, then you use a wide angle really close. In fact, I recommend you don't use that for brides because they're not going to be happy with their photos with their nose 4 times bigger than it should be. So when I was doing wedding photography, this was one of my favorite lenses, was the 70-200, especially during the ceremony where you don't really want to get right up close with the bride and groom. You can sit back behind the crowd a little or at a decent distance, and you can frame the bride. You can get really nice close-up framing. And with the longer lens, you can frame them nicely without distortion, because in fact it flattens perspective a little, so it's more flattering for portrait photographs. In fact, if you're using a full-frame sensor, even a 50mm normal lens or standard lens can cause some distortion, so you're better off going from 80mm plus. So 85mm lens is really a popular portrait lens, and 135 if you want to bring the subject a little closer. Now this is probably a good time to talk about crop factor too, because now this is a full frame sensor, so 50mm is 1 times magnification or a normal lens, but a lot of the popular ones are actually a crop sensor, and what that means is the sensor size is a little bit smaller. So I can give you a quick comparison actually on the camera here. You can get an idea. Okay, so let's move the mirror out the way, and that's the actual sensor at the back. I'm taking a long exposure here so you can see. And now if I put that side by side with the crop factor, okay, so here we have the Canon 60D. Okay, so there's the 2 cameras side by side now. And you can see the sensor size on that one's a lot smaller compared to this one, which is... And in fact, the crop factor is 1.6. So the sensor on the Canon 60D is 1.6 times smaller. So if you divide it by 1.6, that's the actual size you'll get on the Canon 60D. Now that's important for when you're thinking about which lens to use, because now you're in a situation where for a particular focal length you're going to get a different magnification for these crop sensor cameras. I'll actually just show you quickly on the board what I mean. So now if we take the 2 sensors, so that'll be a full frame, and then the crop sensor, which is just over half the size. Now what it is using different lenses, and although the lens is the same lens on each particular sensor, what happens is because of the crop, you're only getting a portion of the scene. So what happens is the lens is actually projecting this image. So whatever lens you have, it's projecting this image. So that's our full frame sensor. So it's picking up the image from the lens. Now with a crop factor, you have the same size image projected, or the same angle projected from the lens, but now you're only covering a small portion of that. You're covering just over half the amount that the actual lens is projecting. So that's why what happens is it's a narrower view. Ultimately, it works out that's a narrow view. So it becomes effectively a magnification factor. So for the Canon 60D or the T2i or the T3i and the 70, they all have a 1.6 crop factor. So that becomes effectively a multiplication. So if you had a 200mm lens, 200mm lens focal length, which is like a telephoto, a reasonable telephoto, you actually multiply that out and you'll find it turns out to be equivalent to a 320mm lens. So it's not that it becomes a 320mm, but effectively it's taking a smaller piece of that 200mm, and the magnification becomes equivalent to a 320mm lens. So that's important, because really your field of view is narrower now because you're dealing with this cropped sensor. So it has its advantages. If you only have a 200mm lens but you want to get close to your subject, you put it on a crop factor camera and you suddenly have almost double the magnification, which is really handy for like wildlife or event photography where you want to get much closer. But the downside is on the wide side of things, on a crop sensor, if you put let's say a 20mm lens, then on a full frame sensor that's a reasonably wide view. It's anything below 24mm is getting quite wide. And remembering that 50mm is basically normal or a standard lens, which 1x magnification. So this starts getting quite wide. But you put it on a crop factor camera, 1.6, and then you end up with equivalent of a 32mm lens, which is not so wide. That's heading more in the range of a standard lens. So that just shows you that if you need to get a wider view, you're going to you have to get a smaller focal length lens or use a full frame sensor. So there's a bunch of things to consider. So when you're considering what lenses you're going to use, you'll find it will vary a little bit whether you've got a full frame or a crop sensor. And actually on the Nikons it's usually a 1.5. The crop factor is not as great as the Canons. So you're getting a little bit wider view than the Canons on the crop factor. But on the other side of the scale, the Canons will have a little bit more reach. You'll get a slightly more telephoto effect, slightly more magnification. Before I used mostly a full frame sensor, now I'm using a crop sensor more, and I find my most common lens now is the actual 16 to 35mm, whereas on the full frame sensor I tended to have the 35 to 70mm lens on the camera more often for most shots. So it does have so it is something to consider which camera body you have, and that gives you some decisions as to which lenses you're going to pick up and use. So that covers focal length and lens choice, which is really important, and it is a big factor involved in framing your photograph and deciding what kind of perspective you want. The next thing that is quite important in framing your picture, which a lot of people don't talk about, is just whether you're going to have it as a landscape picture or whether you're going to turn your camera on the side and actually have it so it's in portrait format. In other words, are you going to have a picture that's taller than it is wide, or are you going to have a wide picture? And that can give a totally different look to your subject depending which way you frame that. Now we're going to go more into like rules. They're kind of rules, but you can bend them, and it's good to be aware of certain principles. See, there's certain things that in photography generally that if you know some basic composition rules, it helps your pictures, whether you're taking with point and shoots, digital SLRs. One thing I like about digital SLRs, and one of the benefits of framing and composing, is the fact that you do look straight through the lens and you have this view that's not complicated. You can really isolate in what you're looking at. You don't have any distractions, and it lets you think about your subject and what's in the background better, because that's an important thing to consider, is what's in the background. Some people just take the photograph of their subject, but they don't consider necessarily what's behind it. So you have to have a whole view of the scene and think about, okay, what's behind there? Could I reframe that so that the background's more appealing? Yeah, so definitely a benefit of SLR cameras. But like I say, these particular tips and knowing some basics about composition can help. It doesn't matter what camera you have. You can be using an iPhone and it'll improve your photography. So one of the things people do, which I'll demonstrate now, is quite often when they take pictures of people, they have the person's head, so it's like straight down the middle, because it's natural for us to focus in on the person's face. So when they're taking the photograph, they just focus in on their face and just frame the person so their face is straight in the middle, and that doesn't occasionally it works having a perfectly symmetrical picture, but most of the times it's not the most pleasing composition. And the same holds true for when you take landscape pictures. A lot of people just put the landscape line straight down the middle, and so you have equal sky and equal land, and that doesn't always create the most pleasing picture either. So one of the things to think about too is having, like for instance, if the person's facing a certain direction, if you just place the person smack in the middle and they're looking in that direction, one of the reasons it's not so pleasing is you haven't left room, you haven't left any space in front of them. So it's good to, space is an important thing to think about in composition. So you actually want to leave, so if someone's looking that direction, you leave a bit of space for them to look into in the picture, and it creates a more pleasing composition. So that's one of the things to think about. And you definitely don't want to go the other extreme where someone's right on the edge of the frame looking out of the photo, because that would almost become agitating. People will be wondering, well, you know, why they're looking out of the picture kind of thing. So it's good to think about framing so something's moving, especially if it's a runner or something moving. It's quite nice to have that little bit of room in the photograph. So you have them so you have less room behind them, a little bit more room in front of them, so they have place to move into, and it just seems to be more appealing. So on that note, I have a good question. What do these things have in common? The nautilus shell, the Parthenon, and daisies. Well, some of you may know and some of you may not. And the thing they have in common is what's called the golden mean. And a lot of people have actually called it the thirds rule, which is really a simplification. It really goes back to what's called the Fibonacci numbers, or the Fibonacci sequence. This is going to be the math part of the lesson today. And the mathematician Fibonacci found that if you take a number starting with 0 and then 1, and then you add the two numbers to create the next number, so then you end up with 1 again, and then 1 plus 1 is 2, 1 plus 2 is 3, and then 3 plus 2 is 5, and then 8, and then 13, and the number gets bigger and bigger. Then we're up to 21, 34, and so on and so on and so on, and this number gets larger and larger. And what Fibonacci found is as the sequence gets larger and larger, the ratio of one number to the one before it starts becoming 1.618. And a few decimals like 0, more decimals like 0, 3, 4. So as the sequence goes on, it starts basically getting closer and closer to this number, and they've actually given it was given a Greek letter phi. And it's really, the fascinating thing about this number is it's found a lot in nature, like on a lot of flowers. These are the numbers of petals you see. And in daisies, you see like daisies with 13, 21, 34. And not every single flower, but a lot of things in nature seem to follow the sequence. And including the way seeds are arranged on sunflower heads and all sorts of interesting things like that. And even the way the stems grow from little branches grow from the main stem on different flowers and trees. And they found that it optimizes the amount of sun that gets to the lower branches. So really fascinating number. And of course the famous example is the nautilus shell, which I'll show you an interesting way of drawing the nautilus shell. If we start off with a little square, so this is basically going to follow that Fibonacci sequence. So we've got a square, 1 by 1, and then we add another square, and now we take the longest side, which is 2, and we add it to that one. So it's like the Fibonacci sequence where we keep adding the previous pairs. And then we draw that rectangle, and then we take once again the long side. In this case it'll actually be 3, and we add 3 to there, and then we take the long side and we add that again, which will actually be 5. We're adding 5 by 5 to that, and then we'll keep going, take the long side, add it to there, and then I'll just do one more here. And now if you draw a curve starting from this inside here, you see that it actually creates that nautilus shell. Now this is just an approximation, because these would actually be the ratios all the way in, but this is showing you how you can start with the beginning of the Fibonacci sequence and it gets closer to that golden mean. And so this is found a lot in nature with shells, and it's been used a lot in architecture. Like I showed you the picture of the Parthenon before, if you actually break up the structure of the Parthenon, you'll see there's elements that fit on those golden mean lines. So it's quite interesting. So it's been used throughout history with art and architecture, and now being discovered a lot in nature as well. Seems to be a really important number and related to aesthetically pleasing things. And they've even called it the divine ratio, and like I said, it's also called the golden mean. So you can find that if you divide your image up into these the golden mean ratios, actually there is a golden mean size where this is 1 and that's 1.618. The ratio between those gives you what's called the golden rectangle, which is a very pleasing size. In fact, the interesting thing is, things like even a credit card has that ratio. I don't think the person who invented the credit card sort of necessarily looked at the golden mean to see how to actually size it, but I think it just happened that it was a pleasing to the eye, that particular ratio. And so if you get your image like this and you divide it in that ratio, so that'll be the 1 and that'll be the 1.618, and you can do it the same from the other side, and you break your picture up like that. Now they found that painters and that in the past have found that if interesting things are placed on these, particularly on these points where these lines intersect, it creates a more pleasing image. And like I say, there is the basic simplification of this is thirds, and the thirds lines are actually a little bit out from those. So the golden mean lines come a little bit closer into the middle. But anywhere in those regions it creates a more pleasing image. So when you're taking a sunset photograph and you've got you've got your amazing sunset, great drawing, I know, and let's say you have let's just say you have the ocean. Instead of placing that ocean straight down the middle, which is all right, but it's not as pleasing to the eye as placing it on close to the golden mean or the thirds line. So that becomes your ocean there and your sunset there. And likewise, you can change it the other way around, where you have a seascape where the horizon line's actually on the thirds line there. So you got mostly water in the foreground, so around 2/3 is water, and then you have a little sky above that. So that's a good way to think about framing your images. Now, actually, what we'll do now is we'll go to the computer and I'll show you some of the pictures that I've taken, which some of them I thought, wow, these are pleasing to the eye. I thought this, I like the way it looks. And I overlaid the thirds lines and golden means, and it's quite interesting that the ones that I consider more pleasing to the eye usually obey pretty closely the golden mean lines. So there's something inherent about these proportions that make it pleasing. So if the only thing you get from this particular video is to think about placing your images on, not straight in the center, but just around the third position, like just in from the thirds, and start experimenting, putting putting your horizon lines on those positions and putting interesting objects on those points. And that can be like if it's someone's face, for instance, and you've actually got a relatively close-up of the person's face. Their head can be there, like that, and maybe their eyes are on that golden mean position. So that makes a more interesting composition. And you'll find that when you do that, it'll actually, somehow there's something about it that just looks a little bit more appealing. Let's go back to the computer and I'll show you with some images how that can improve your composition thinking about those lines. This particular photograph, to me, always had a nice balance to it. So even though the mountains are kind of down the center, that's not really the subject of the photograph. So my sun in the foreground is. Now what I did is I overlaid the thirds lines just to see where it fits, and you can see his head is roughly in the position of that intersection of the thirds line. And you can see, and also the feature down here. So there's some lining up, and then I put the golden mean on just to see how it compares, and that's even stronger. Here you can see his head's pretty much exactly on that golden mean intersection there. So I found that very interesting. That to me, that picture just had a good balance to it, and it lines up fairly close to the golden mean lines. Now let me give you some other examples here. We have the Canadian goose shot. Now this is a case where it just happened that the horizon is pretty much exactly on that golden mean line, and the Canadian goose body kind of axis is more or less on the vertical golden mean line. And once again, this is a photo which seemed to have a nice balance to it. And also we have this bright red object on this side, and then the Canadian goose on that side, so there's a little bit of balance there as well. Now this is a good example of leaving a bit of space. You can see the little American robins facing to the left here, and I've left a little bit of room there so that it's looking into the space. So that was an example of that leaving space that I mentioned earlier. And once again, if we overlay the thirds lines, it's pretty much body axis is on the thirds, and the golden mean lines once again fairly close to the golden mean as well. So you can see if we just remove the thirds lines that the beak is almost exactly on that golden mean, and the eye is very close. So within that region of the thirds and golden mean. In fact, the actual head, the axis of the head there with the eye and the beak is really on that golden mean line fairly strongly, so leading to quite a nice composition. Example here, we're looking at something that wasn't exactly on the golden mean in thirds, but close to the thirds line. We have my little daughter here. Her body is fairly close to that thirds line. So it wouldn't have been as strong a composition if I'd put her straight in the middle, because there would have been no balance, because here we have the horses to the side here, and we have the little foal and my daughter here. So if I'd put her in the center, what would have happened is we would have had the two horses on the side kind of clipped off here, not leading to a very balanced picture. So this composition looks a lot nicer. Even though she's pushed a little bit further out, it's given room for the actual horses here. And you can see the horizontal golden mean lines here pretty much encompass the major interests in the photograph, like she's feeding some grass here that's almost on that horizontal golden mean line. And here's another example with flowers, once again fairly close to the golden mean and thirds, that rough region there. So interesting that to look at how close these match to those rules, even though at the time I may not have been thinking consciously. It's like become more of a subconscious thing for me to balance the picture out and not put things central. Here's an example of where we have like a tilted horizon effect, and that's that you can see that you got almost 2/3 of foreground and only about 1/3 of sky here. So it's a good example of how it's used in a landscape photograph. And a little closer to thirds than golden mean in this case. Okay, you're probably starting to get the idea here, so I'll just give just 2 more examples quick. Here's a bride shot I took in Hawaii, and once again pretty much lining up with the golden mean. Her body axis is like kind of closer to the golden mean, like her face, and that's the kind of interest of the picture. If you look at this picture, it's the look of her face looking out to sea, and that's where the eye gets drawn to, and it's on that vertical golden mean line, and the bokeh is more or less just a little under that line as well. And one more example, in this case we have a sunset. Now this is a case where you can bend the rules a little. So like I say, these are basic composition rules, and to know them will improve your photographs overnight, especially if you weren't aware of them before. But in some cases you actually want to bend them a little, and the reason for bending them in this case is I really wanted more sky because the cloud patterns were so amazing. So you can see that the third lines, it's a little lower. The barn's kind of put fairly close to the thirds line, and the top of the barn is kind of on that golden mean. But you can see I've actually included more sky here because I wanted that dramatic clouds. I wanted more of the dramatic clouds, especially at the top of the picture. So, but the barn, having said that, the peak of the barn here is hovering around that thirds golden rule vertical line. So in that respect, it is still having that balance rather than having it central. So as far as verticals go, it is still lining up with those lines, but not strictly on the horizontal plane. But you can see it still makes a pleasing composition just having that barn off to the left. And this course is specifically about digital SLRs, and although all these composition rules will help you regardless of the camera you're using, what I did is I pulled up a few focusing planes on certain cameras just to give you an idea of how they relate to the golden mean. So if I put the thirds lines in the golden mean here, you can see now with a Canon T2i, which would be similar to the T3i, if you place subjects close to these 4 focusing points on the diagonals here, diagonals from the center, that's going to put you close to the golden mean. Like vertically, it's pretty much on the thirds line, but if you look at the horizontal golden mean, it pretty much cuts exactly through those focusing lines. So for landscape, if you have the horizon line on those focusing points or on these focusing points, you pretty much spot on the golden mean there. And then if you put the verticals, something on that position and a little in from that outside position, you'll be on the exact intersect of the golden mean there. And let me show you some other examples. This is the Canon 60D. Once again, the focusing lines line up with the vertical thirds, but horizontally they line up with these golden mean lines. So that gives you an idea for putting your horizon lines on those focusing points as well. And here we have the Canon 7D. So with the Canon 7D, you find that the thirds lines line up with these diagonal focusing points, and horizontally the horizontal golden mean lines pretty much cut through both these rows of focusing points. So it's going to be fairly easy to line up your horizons with this camera. And as far as being on the exact intersect of the golden mean lines, it's a little out from these diagonals that make up the center square focusing points. And here's Canon 5D. Now here, to get to the golden mean intersect, you want to be just a little out from these diagonal focusing points and just under these vertical focusing points, and that'll give you the intersection. So this gives you an idea. So when you're using your camera, you can start thinking about which focusing points are going to create a more pleasing composition. Now for Nikon users, here's the D30-100, which will be similar to the D50-100 as well, and once again these diagonal focusing points are the spot to put things. Now, like the Canons, as far as putting your horizon line goes, you can pretty much put it exactly on those diagonal focusing points, either the top or the bottom. But to get it on the vertical golden means you want to bring it in a little from that, so about a third of the way in towards the center from those focusing points. And here's the D7000, and here, because you have so many focusing points, you've got a little bit more of a choice. So to put, there's actually points that are exactly on the golden mean lines, and it's these focusing points. So if you take it from the center, they're the diagonals that are 2 points away from the center on these 4 focusing points. So if you want to lock on exactly on the golden mean intersections, those are the points to use. And then the thirds will be the next ones over for the thirds verticals. And for the horizontal line thirds, it'll be just under these. So, but these really will put you in the prime spots for placing objects that'll create quite a pleasing image. So I thought that would be useful just to, when you look through your camera, just to have an idea of where your focusing points are related to those thirds lines. And in fact, some cameras, when you're in live view, they may even have an overlay grid where you can show the thirds lines to see how your picture is being composed. But they usually don't have golden mean, so you just got to think about that golden mean as a little bit in from the thirds, and that will help your pictures overall. So I hope you found that useful. You can pretty much go out there now and put your camera on auto, because I haven't covered all the manual features yet. But if you go out there and start thinking about those thirds rules and actually start taking photographs bearing in mind those thirds lines and golden mean lines, you'll find that your composition will start looking a lot better fairly quickly. And then it's just a case of practicing, and your eye becomes more trained to that, and you'll start being able to compose your pictures better. Now there's other things to consider with composition, but I've basically honed in on these particular rules because they're the fastest way to improve your composition. I mean, there's other things like symmetry to consider, and of course I mentioned space, leaving space in front of your subject, and then it's just a case of artistic eye. You know, as you develop your eye for seeing what looks good, then you can start bending and breaking rules and coming up with compositions that are a little bit new and may not exactly fit in with these rules, but they're still appealing to the eye. But this will really get you started so that you can practice right now and see if your pictures start looking better. So thank you for listening, and in the next video we're going to start on the exposure values and how to get the correct exposure